The air in the El Paso cantina was as thick and sour as old tequila. Flies buzzed a lazy circle over the card table where Tom Garrett's luck had finally run dry. His last 3 silver dollars lay beside a sweat-stained letter, sealed with a smear of black wax. Across from him a man called Tuco. The kid laid down his cards, a winning hand, with the deliberate slowness of a spider building its web. Garrett's shoulders slumped. "Take it, it's all I got." Tuco ignored the coins. His dark eyes, hard as obsidian chips, were fixed on the letter. The silver was never the wager, viejo. He snatched the envelope, cracked the seal with a dirty thumb, and scanned the contents. A cruel smile twisted his lips. He rose from the table, his gaze sweeping past Garrett to a shadowed corner of the room. There, a figure sat hunched and still, completely obscured by a heavy wool poncho despite the suffocating heat. "The letter tells me of a woman," Tuco sneered, his voice cutting through the bar's low murmur. "A woman branded for her sins who holds a map in her memory." He stalked toward the corner. "And now, I know where to find her." Before anyone could move, he ripped the poncho away, revealing a young woman, her face pale with terror. On her cheek, stark against the skin, was the faint, scarred outline of a hangman's noose. She was the prize, and everyone in that room knew her life had just been lost. A thick, predatory silence fell over the cantina as Tuco, the kid, seized the woman's arm. She flinched, a sharp intake of breath, the only sound she made, her eyes wide and fixed on the swinging doors as if willing them to offer an escape that would not come. He yanked her to her feet. The stained wool poncho crumpled to the dusty floorboards. "Time to see where this map of yours leads," Tuco rasped, his knuckles white around her arm. He began to drag her toward the exit, the other patrons shrinking back, turning their faces to their drinks, their cards, to anything but the grim spectacle. Tom Garrett stared at his own empty hands on the table, a portrait of impotent shame. The scrape of a chair leg against wood cut through the room. From a corner that had been lost in shadow, a man rose. He was not large, nor did he carry the swagger of a gunslinger. He was just a man named Ethan Call, who had been nursing a lukewarm beer for the better part of an hour, watching the world through quiet, steady eyes. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. Let her go. The words were simple, spoken with no more force than a statement about the weather, yet they hung in the air like a death sentence. Tuco stopped, turning slowly, a look of amused disbelief twisting his features. He saw only a plain man in a worn coat. "I don't recall asking for your opinion, friend." Ethan ignored him. He walked to the long, pockmarked bar, his boots making a soft, deliberate rhythm on the floor. He unbuckled his gun belt, coiled it, and placed the heavy Colt revolver on the polished wood. With a flick of his wrist, he sent it sliding to the center of the bar where it spun once before coming to a rest, its handle pointing toward Tuco. "The game ain't over," Ethan said, his voice as flat and hard as the plains. "You won the letter from him." He nodded once at the broken figure of Tom Garrett. "The girl is a different hand, and her pot is on the table." The challenge was as clear as it was insane. He wasn't betting silver or gold. He was betting his life against Tuco's. The routine of casual cruelty shattered. This was no longer an auction or a repossession. It was a reckoning. Tuco's sneer vanished, replaced by the cold calculation of a killer. He slowly released the woman's arm. She stumbled back a step, her gaze darting from Tuco to the quiet man who had just signed his own death warrant for her. Ethan's eyes met hers for the first time. They held no pity, only a calm resolve that was somehow more terrifying than Tuco's rage. "What do they call you, miss?" Her throat worked for a moment before a sound emerged, a whisper barely audible over the buzzing of the flies. "Clara." The name settled in the air. For a fleeting instant, Ethan's composure cracked. A flicker of something, recognition, pain, a memory long buried, crossed his face before the mask of calm fell back into place. His quiet life was over. He had just bought himself a war, and its name was Clara. Tuco. The kid laughed, a dry, grating sound. He pushed Clara away from him and she stumbled, catching herself against a wooden post. He sauntered to the bar, his eyes never leaving Ethan. He picked up the Colt, weighed it in his hand, then contemptuously slid it back down the bar toward Ethan. "I got my own," Tuco said, patting the bone-handled pistol at his hip. "And I don't play games with farmers." He took a shot glass from the bar, filled it to the brim with tequila, and placed it on the far end of the long table where Tom Garrett still sat, head in his hands. "One shot," Tuco announced to the silent room. "We both fire on the count of 3. You hit the glass? I walk away. I hit it, she's mine. We both miss. We shoot at each other. It wasn't a duel. It was an execution with a chance of parlor tricks. Ethan's face remained a blank canvas. He walked back to his starting position, his own pistol now back in his hand. He didn't look at Clara, but he could feel her gaze on him, a weight of disbelief and terror. The barkeep, a man with the weary eyes of someone who'd seen it all, began the count. 1. Ethan raised his pistol, his arm steady. Across from him, Tuco did the same, a predator's grin plastered on his face. 2. The air grew thin. The buzzing of the flies seemed to stop. Clara held her breath, her knuckles white where she gripped the post. She saw Ethan's thumb slowly pull back the hammer. Click. The sound was deafening in the silence. The barkeep never said 3. Ethan fired. The explosion rocked the cantina. The shot glass on the far table didn't just shatter. It vaporized, a fine mist of glass and tequila vanishing into the air. Tuco froze, his pistol still aimed, his mouth agape. He hadn't even processed the count was broken. The room was stunned. Ethan hadn't played the game. He had ended it. He lowered his pistol, a thin curl of smoke rising from the barrel. His gaze locked onto Tuco's, and for the first time, there was something other than calm in his eyes. It was a cold, hard finality. I don't miss, Ethan said, his voice low. Get out. Humiliation burned in Tuco's eyes, hotter than rage. He opened his mouth to speak, but the dead certainty in Ethan's stare choked the words in his throat. This man had just proven he could have put a bullet between his eyes before he'd even blinked. Slowly, venomously, Tuco holstered his pistol. He shot a look of pure hatred at Clara, then at Ethan. He turned and stormed out of the cantina, shoving the swinging doors so hard they slammed against the outer walls. Silence returned, heavy and thick. Ethan walked to the bar, methodically reloaded the spent chamber, and holstered his weapon. He turned to Clara. She still hadn't moved, her body rigid. He didn't approach her. He just stood there, letting the space between them remain. You can stay or you can go, he said simply. He tossed a few coins on the bar, enough to cover his beer and the damage. He nodded once to the barkeep and walked toward the exit, not looking back to see if she would follow. Clara watched him go. She looked at the patrons, who were now staring at her with a mixture of pity and raw curiosity. She looked at Tom Garrett, who wouldn't meet her eyes. Staying meant waiting for Tuco to return, or for the next man like him. Going meant trusting the quiet stranger who killed for a principle he hadn't explained. She pushed herself off the post, her legs unsteady, and followed the sound of his footsteps into the blinding sun. They walked out of El Paso without a word. Ethan set a slow, steady pace, never so fast that she couldn't keep up, but never looking back. The sun beat down, baking the dust on the street into a hard crust. Clara kept her eyes on the ground, the scarred noose on her cheek burning with shame. Every shadow seemed to hold the shape of Tuco. Every distant rider was a threat. Her life had been a series of cages, and she couldn't be sure this wasn't just another one, with a different kind of warden. Hours later, as dusk began to bleed purple and orange across the horizon, Ethan led them off the main trail into a small, sheltered arroyo. He gathered brush for a fire with an economy of motion that spoke of a life lived on the move. He didn't ask for her help. He didn't ask for anything. Clara sank to the ground, pulling her knees to her chest, watching him. He was an enigma. He moved with a purpose that felt older than the anger in Tuco's eyes. When the fire was crackling, he pulled 2 tins of beans from his saddlebag and set them near the flames to warm. He handed one to her, along with a bent spoon, his calloused fingers brushing hers for a brief, startling moment. He sat across the fire from her, poking the embers with a stick. The silence stretched, filled only by the crackle of burning mesquite. There was a man once, Ethan said, his voice soft, directed at the flames more than at her. Had a wife. She took a fever. Lasted a week. Toward the end, she couldn't eat much. But every night, he'd cook 2 plates, just so her place at the table wouldn't be empty. He looked up and his eyes met hers across the dancing light. Heard he kept doing it for a year after she was gone. Some habits are hard to break. He didn't say any more. He didn't need to. In that small, broken story, he had laid a piece of himself bare. He wasn't a gunslinger. He was a man who understood loss. It was the first crack in his armor, a glint of a past that hurt. Clara ate her beans, the first real food she'd had in days. She watched him, his profile stark against the firelight, and the fear inside her began to curdle, changing into something else. curiosity. Later, when she had drifted into a fitful sleep, Ethan stared into the dying embers. The image of the scar on her cheek was burned into his mind. The firelight flickered, and the desert night dissolved. He was in the snow, not the gentle dust of a Texas winter, but the deep, killing white of the high country, 3 years gone. His leg was broken, a raw, jagged edge of bone pushing against the skin. He was freezing, the world fading to a gray haze. He had given up. Then, a shape. A figure wrapped in hides, their face obscured by a scarf against the biting wind. He remembered hands, smaller than his, forcing bitter tea and broth between his chapped lips. He remembered being dragged onto a makeshift travois. He spent days in a haze of pain and fever in a tiny lean-to shelter. His savior never spoke a word. He never saw a face, only felt a presence. On the 4th day, he woke up, clear-headed, to find the fire stoked, a supply of food and water beside him, and a small leather-bound pouch. Inside was a single perfect eagle feather. He was alone. The person was gone. He had lived. He never knew who saved him. He had only a name, scratched into the dirt floor of the shelter before the figure left. A name he saw just before the snows came again and covered it. Clara. He looked across the fire at the sleeping woman, at the faint, cruel mark on her cheek that hadn't been there in his memory. It was her. He was sure of it. This wasn't charity. It wasn't chivalry. It was a debt, and Ethan Call always paid his debts. The sun rose hot and white, bleaching the color from the sky. They broke their fast with cold jerky and the last of the water from Ethan's canteen. He said nothing about the night before, nothing of the debt he carried in his memory. He simply packed their few belongings with the same quiet efficiency, his movements economical and sure. For the first time, Clara didn't just watch him. She helped, gathering the charred sticks from the fire and burying the ashes, her hands moving with a hesitant grace. It was a small, unspoken pact, a fragile truce in the war for her life. They rode for hours, the silence between them no longer a cage of fear, but a shared space of exhaustion. The landscape flattened into a cracked, sun-scorched plain dotted with skeletal mesquite. There was nowhere to hide. Every rider on the horizon was a potential threat, every dust devil a harbinger of doom. Ethan rode slightly ahead, a shield against the vast emptiness, his body a tense line as he scanned the horizon. Around midday, he reined in his horse near a cluster of rust-colored boulders that offered a sliver of shade. As he dismounted to refill their canteens from a skin of water he'd kept in reserve, Clara spoke. Her voice was raspy from disuse. "That mark," she said, her fingers ghosting over her cheek, but not touching the scar. "It's not what you think." Ethan stopped his work, his back still to her. He remained perfectly still, listening. "My father found a place," she began, the words coming in a slow, painful trickle, "up in the Sangre de Cristos, a hidden valley with a spring that never runs dry. Water so clean you can see the stones at the bottom. He called it Agua Clara. He named me for it." She paused, taking a breath that hitched in her chest. "It was our secret, our paradise. But secrets in this land are a currency. A man who worked for my father betrayed us, brought a small gang, looking to claim the water rights for themselves. They killed my father, my mother." Ethan turned slowly. His face was unreadable, carved from the same stone as the landscape around them. "They wanted the route, the landmarks, the way through the canyons that only we knew. I wouldn't tell them, so they used a rope, not to hang me, to scare me. They heated a branding iron bent into the shape of a noose, a promise of what would come if I didn't talk." Her voice broke, but she forced it steady. "Tom Garrett was with them, but he had a conscience, what was left of it. He shot the man holding the iron and got me out of there. He's been hiding me ever since, trying to get me to safety. The letter Tuco took, it didn't have the map. It only said that I was the key to it. The confession hung in the dead air, raw and terrible. The brand wasn't a mark of shame. It was a testament to her defiance. The map wasn't in her memory. It was her memory, the last piece of a life that had been stolen from her. The stakes were no longer just her freedom. It was her family's legacy, a sacred place of life in a dying land. And Tuco. The kid was hunting it. Ethan's gaze dropped to the ground. He picked up a small, flat stone, turning it over and over in his palm. He had intervened to pay a life debt. He now found himself the guardian of a sanctuary he'd never seen, standing against men who would bleed it dry for profit. The easy way out, leaving her at the next town, giving her some silver, was gone. It had never really been there. "We keep moving north," he said finally, his voice flat. It wasn't a question, it was a statement of fact. He was in this now, all the way. That small moment of shared truth, a fragile seed of hope, was scorched from the earth less than an hour later. Ethan, leading their horses through a narrow wash, froze. He held up a hand, and Clara stopped instantly. He pointed with his chin. Ahead, nestled under an overhang, were the fresh remains of a campfire. It wasn't the fire that held his attention. It was what was next to it. 3 crows, their necks snapped, had been laid out in a precise straight line. A sign, a message. "He's not just following," Ethan murmured, his eyes scanning the ridges above them. "He's flanking us. He knows this territory." The abstract threat of Tuco had just been given a face, a brutal signature. He wasn't a distant rider anymore. He was here, in the rocks above them, in the air they breathed. He was playing with them, letting them know he was the predator, and they were the prey. All the easy outs had just been sealed. There was no law out here, no cavalry coming over the hill. There was only Ethan, Clara, and the vast hostile wilderness that Tuco was turning into a cage. They pushed on, the pace now urgent, the silence filled with the new, terrifying weight of certainty. As the sun began its slow descent, casting long, menacing shadows from the saguaros, they rounded a bend and saw it. It was Tom Garrett. He was hanging from the lone, twisted branch of a dead ironwood tree, his body turning slowly in the evening breeze. Pinned to his chest by a bowie knife was a piece of paper. Ethan dismounted, his movements grim, and walked to the tree. He pulled the knife free and read the note. He didn't need to. He already knew what it would say. He crumpled it in his fist without showing it to Clara, but she saw the look on his face, the last sliver of hope. The idea that they might somehow slip through Tuco's net vanished. This wasn't a game of cards anymore. This was a hunt to the death. They were no longer running from a man. They were running from a ghost who was everywhere at once. A ghost who left bodies in his wake and was now drawing a tight, inescapable circle around them. Despair settled in, cold and heavy as a burial shroud. They were alone, and the monster was no longer in the shadows. He was walking right behind them. The taste of ash was in Clara's mouth. They had stopped running. In the belly of a narrow rock-strewn canyon her father had once described as the devil's jawbone, they had made their stand. The place was a natural fortress, a dead end. There was no retreat. Ethan had positioned himself high up in the fractured rocks, a ghost with a rifle, leaving Clara in the relative shelter of a deep crevice below. The plan was simple, desperate. Let the monster walk into the trap. As the last rays of sun painted the canyon walls in blood-red light, they came. 3 figures, silhouetted against the twilight sky on the ridge above. Tuco was in the lead, walking with the easy arrogance of a man who believed the game was already won. He paused, scanning the canyon floor, his head cocked like a carrion bird. The first shot was an echo before it was a sound. One of Tuco's men, walking 10 feet to his left, crumpled without a cry, a single dark hole appearing in his chest. He tumbled down the scree slope, his body coming to a rest in a heap of dusty limbs. Panic erupted. The second man dove for cover behind a cluster of boulders, firing his pistol wildly into the shadows. The bullets ricocheted with angry whines, sparking off the rock face far from Ethan's perch. Tuco didn't flinch. He laughed, a raw, ugly sound that echoed off the stone walls. "One shot, farmer!" he bellowed, his voice mocking Ethan. "That's all you get before we find you. And what about the girl? You think I don't know she's the key?" He moved with a snake's speed, disappearing behind an outcropping, his voice now a disembodied taunt. "I can smell that valley on her," Ethan called. "Smell the water. I'll own it. I'll own her. Just like I owned Garrett." Clara pressed herself flat against the cold rock, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was her fault. This canyon, this trap, the memory of her father's voice, telling her of this place, was now a curse. But then another memory surfaced, sharper. "The east wall is rotten, Clara Bell. A whisper can bring it down." Ethan fired again, the shot chipping stone inches from the second gunman's head, pinning him down. It was now or never. Pushing down the terror that threatened to paralyze her, Clara broke cover. She didn't run back, deeper into the canyon. She ran forward, toward the east wall, stumbling over the loose rock as if in a blind panic. "There she is!" the remaining henchman yelled. "She's mine!" Tuco's voice roared, closer now. He scrambled out from his cover, his eyes locked on her. glinting with triumph. He saw a terrified girl making a fatal mistake, running into a corner. He didn't see the strategist. Ethan saw her plan unfold and his blood ran cold. He had to trust her. He kept his sights trained on the second man, holding him in place. Clara scrambled up a short, steep incline, her boots slipping on the loose shale. She reached a narrow ledge running along the rotten wall. It was a dead end. She pressed her back against the rock, her chest heaving, playing the part of cornered prey. Tuco was on her in seconds, his face a mask of predatory glee. He holstered his pistol, wanting to savor this. "Nowhere left to run, little map," he rasped, reaching for her. "You're going to walk me right to your daddy's little puddle. Every step." He lunged. At that exact moment, Clara shoved herself away from the wall, dropping low and scuttling sideways. Her hand, which had been clenched at her side, opened. She hadn't been empty-handed. She'd been gripping a heavy, sharp-edged stone. With all her strength, she didn't throw it at Tuco. She slammed it against the rock face beside her, right on a web of deep, sun-baked cracks. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, a low groan emanated from the rock itself. It was the sound of a giant waking up. The ledge beneath Tuco's feet shuddered. He froze, his eyes widening in disbelief as the wall behind him began to fracture. A shower of pebbles turned into a cascade of boulders. He threw up his arms with a strangled cry as the rockslide consumed him, not burying him completely, but sweeping his legs out from under him and pinning him against the canyon floor in an avalanche of stone and dust. A sickening crack echoed through the canyon, the sound of bone giving way. The second gunman, distracted by the roar of the rockslide, turned his head for a fatal instant. It was all the time Ethan needed. The rifle cracked once more. The man collapsed. Silence descended, thick and absolute, broken only by Tuco's ragged, pain-filled breaths. Ethan slid down from his perch, his boots kicking up dust, his rifle held ready. He moved toward the cloud of settling dust where Tuco lay, his leg trapped and twisted at an unnatural angle under a massive slab of rock. His pistol lay 10 feet away, half buried in the shale. He was helpless. Clara stood on solid ground, her body trembling with adrenaline. She watched Ethan approach the man who had haunted her every step. "Call!" Tuco hissed, spitting a mouthful of bloody dust. "You should have killed me in the cantina." Ethan stood over him, the rifle's muzzle pointed at his chest. His face was grim, his finger tight on the trigger. All the pain, the fear, the death, it could all end right here, with one final squeeze. Justice. Vengeance. "Ethan." Clara's voice cut through the tense air. It was quiet, but it held the strength of forged steel. "No." He looked at her. Her face was streaked with dirt and grime, but her eyes were clear. The fear was gone, replaced by a profound, weary calm. She had faced her monster, and she had won. Not with a bullet, but with a memory and a stone. "It's over," she said. "He doesn't get to make you a killer." Ethan stared down at Tuco, whose eyes burned with impotent fury. He saw the truth in Clara's words. Killing this broken man wouldn't erase Tom Garrett's death. It wouldn't heal the scar on her cheek. It would only be another echo in a canyon already filled with violence. Slowly, deliberately, Ethan lowered the rifle. He walked over to Tuco's discarded pistol, picked it up, and emptied the chambers. He did the same to the guns of the other two men. He gathered their canteens and looped them over his shoulder. He looked down one last time at the trapped, defeated man. "The buzzards will find you before anyone else does," Ethan said, his voice devoid of heat or pity. "Hope you remember the way to water." He turned his back on him. He walked to Clara, his steps sure and steady. He didn't touch her, but his eyes met hers, and in that look, a debt was finally paid and a new promise was made. Together they walked out of the Devil's Jawbone, leaving the ghosts behind them in the dust. The hunt was over. They walked for a full day before the silence broke. The raw, adrenaline-fueled victory in the canyon had evaporated under the relentless sun, leaving behind a hard, brittle truth. Tuco was gone, but the idea of Agua Clara was not. It was a whisper on the wind now, a rumor of paradise that would draw men just like him, again and again. The canyon had been a battle. The war for peace was far from over. That night they made a small, smokeless fire in the lee of a rock formation that looked like a great stone hawk. The landscape was stark, unforgiving. Ethan had been cleaning his rifle, the methodical scrape and click of metal on metal the only sound. Clara watched him, the firelight catching the faint, ugly scar on her cheek. It no longer burned with shame, but it ached with the weight of what it represented. a future of looking over her shoulder. "We can't go there," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "Not to the valley." Ethan paused, a clean patch in his hand. "It's the safest place, defensible. I can fortify it." His words were practical, his mind already working on sight lines, fallback positions, fields of fire. He was thinking like a soldier, a guardian. "And live in a prison?" she countered, a new strength in her tone. "To spend my life waiting for the next Tuco? To turn my father's sanctuary into a fort? No?" She shook her head, not with fear, but with a finality that startled him. "I won't honor his memory by living in a cage, no matter how safe it is. My parents didn't die so I could hide better. They died for a place of life, not a place of siege." Ethan set down the rifle components carefully. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not the terrified girl from the cantina, but a woman forged in the crucible of that canyon. The prey was gone. A strategist was looking back at him. "What then?" he asked. "We can't run forever. The story is out." "Then we change the story," she said. A spark lit her eyes, an idea taking hold. Men like Tuco are driven by one thing: greed. They want what's easy, what's pure, what they can sell. What if agua clara is none of those things? What if it's poison? Ethan stared at her, uncomprehending. "The water is clean." "We know that," she said, leaning forward, the firelight animating her face. "But they don't. We can't hide the valley, so we have to make it a place no one wants to find. We have to kill the legend. We need to create a new one. A legend of a cursed spring, a place that drives men mad, where the water looks pure but is tainted with some sickness of the earth. Loco weed fever, a poison that doesn't kill you quick, but rots you from the inside out." The sheer audacity of the plan settled in the space between them. It was a gambit of incredible cunning, not to fight the greed, but to redirect it with a stronger force. Fear, superstitious, gut-level fear. "How?" Ethan asked, his voice low. He was no longer the planner, he was the student. "A story needs a storyteller," Clara continued, her thoughts racing ahead. "Someone believable, someone who looks like they've seen a ghost. A prospector who stumbled upon it, barely escaped with his mind intact. Someone who can describe the place perfectly, the twin peaks that guard the entrance, the stand of cottonwoods shaped like a hand. So the truth of the location sells the lie of the water." She looked at him and he understood. He was the storyteller. He had the quiet intensity, the haunted look of a man who had seen too much. He could be that man. "We need a place where rumors breed," she went on. "A trade hub, not El Paso, somewhere new, somewhere full of prospectors and drifters heading out to seek their fortunes." "Santa Fe," Ethan said, the name coming to him instantly. "The end of the trail. Everyone passes through Santa Fe." The plan solidified piece by piece in the flickering firelight. It was a weapon made not of steel and lead, but of whispers and lies. They would travel south to Santa Fe. There, Ethan would become a broken man, a cautionary tale. He would seek out the loudest mouths in the dustiest saloons, men whose currency was gossip. He wouldn't announce his story. He would let it be pulled from him, a painful confession over a cheap bottle of whiskey. He would draw a crude map on a napkin, a map to damnation, and let it fall into the right hands. For the first time since that day in the cantina, Clara felt a stirring of something she thought had been bled out of her: hope. It was not the passive hope of rescue, but the active, sharp-edged hope of a general plotting her campaign. She was no longer the map. She was the map maker. 3 weeks later, they were on the outskirts of Santa Fe. The city was a sprawling beehive of adobe, wood, and canvas, humming with the energy of 1,000 different ambitions. Ethan looked the part. He hadn't shaved. His clothes were trail-worn and dusty, and he'd cultivated a twitch in his eye, a haunted, far-off look that kept people at a distance. Clara remained hidden in a small camp they'd made in the hills, mending their gear, waiting. Her role was to be the ghost he was running from. That evening, Ethan walked into a saloon called the Dusty Spur. It was exactly the kind of place they needed: crowded, noisy, and smelling of desperation and cheap tequila. He took a seat at the bar, ordered a bottle, and proceeded to drink, his eyes scanning the room. He ignored the card games, the painted ladies, the loud boasts of grizzled miners. He was waiting for his mark. He found him an hour later, a big barrel-chested man with a booming voice and an audience of sycophants. He was holding court, spinning tales of gold veins so thick you could trip over them. He was a natural amplifier, A man who believed his own stories and ensured everyone else did too. Ethan waited until the man was a few drinks deep, his voice even louder, his audience more rapt. Then Ethan began to talk, not to anyone in particular, but to his own reflection in the murky mirror behind the bar. He spoke in a low, trembling mumble, just loud enough to be overheard. "Looks like heaven," he muttered, shaking his head. "The water, clear as glass. You drink it and you feel strong for a day. Then the dreams start." A man next to him grunted. "What's that, friend?" Ethan flinched as if startled. "Nothing. Talking to myself. A habit I picked up. There's no one else to talk to out there." He took a long pull from the bottle. But the seed was planted. The big prospector's table had gone quiet. His story was old. This one was new. "Out where?" the prospector boomed, his voice cutting across the saloon. Ethan looked over, his eyes wide and unfocused. "You don't want to know. It's a place that ain't on any map." A place God forgot to finish. He let out a dry, rattling laugh that had no humor in it. "They call it Agua Clara, clear water." A cruel joke. The name hung in the air. A few men shifted, their interest piqued. A valley with water was worth more than gold. "I heard stories about a place like that," the prospector said, leaning forward. "Then you heard lies." Ethan snapped, his voice suddenly sharp. He looked around the room, his gaze wild. "The water, it gets in your head. It shows you things. I was with 2 partners. Good men. After a week they started seeing snakes in the rocks, hearing voices in the wind. Jonesy tried to scalp himself with a skinning knife, said he had to let the devil out. We had to tie him up. The next morning Mac was gone. Just walked off into the desert, stark naked, singing hymns. I never saw him again." The saloon was silent now. Ethan's performance was utterly convincing. He was a man on the ragged edge of sanity. "I got out," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I took Jonesy with me, but he died on the trail, clawing at his own face. I buried him under a pile of rocks. The place is cursed. The water is the devil's own brew." The big prospector licked his lips, his greed warring with a newfound fear. "Where is this place?" Ethan laughed again, that same horrifying empty sound. He pulled a piece of crumpled charcoal from his pocket and, on the back of a discarded handbill, began to sketch a map. The Twin Peaks, the cottonwoods shaped like a hand, the entrance to the canyon. It was perfect. "You want it? You can have it," he rasped, shoving the drawing across the bar. "Go drink your fill. Go see the snakes. I'm riding south until I hit the ocean." He threw a few coins on the bar, leaving the nearly full bottle and the cursed map behind. He stumbled out of the saloon, not looking back. He knew the big prospector would take the map. He knew the story would be all over Santa Fe by morning. No one would seek a valley of clear water if they believed it brought madness and death. A gold claim you could defend. A curse was another matter entirely. He met Clara back at their camp. He said nothing, simply sat by the fire she'd built and let the tension drain from his shoulders. They didn't need to speak. The next morning, they watched from the hills as riders left the city. A small group of prospectors, led by the big man from the saloon, were heading east, not north. Later in the day, as Ethan bought supplies in town, he heard the whispers. A cursed valley, a spring that drove men insane. The story had taken root, growing faster and stronger than the truth ever could. That evening, as they rode north, leaving Santa Fe and the lie behind them, Clara looked back at the lights of the city. The scar on her cheek was just a scar now, a pale line on her skin. It was no longer a brand or a promise of violence. It was a memory of a battle she had won not with a gun, but with a story. "It's over," she said, the words carrying the weight of a final, binding truth. Ethan nodded, his gaze on the trail ahead, leading them toward the real Agua Clara. It's over. They had not erased her past. They had reclaimed it. They had taken the source of her pain and powerlessness and forged it into a shield. The valley was finally safe, not because it was hidden, but because in the minds of greedy men, it was now a place of horrors. They had left the ghosts to haunt a lie of their own making. They rode north for 2 days, leaving the dusty lies of Santa Fe to fester and spread behind them. The land changed slowly, the flat, cracked earth giving way to rolling foothills dotted with juniper and piñon pine. The air grew thinner, cleaner. On the morning of the 3rd day, Ethan reined in his horse. Ahead of them, a narrow gap opened between 2 towering granite peaks that looked like ancient, sleeping giants. Clara moved up beside him, her breath catching in her throat. "This is it," she whispered, her voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. It was the entrance, the gateway to a life she thought was lost forever. Ethan nodded, his gaze sweeping the entrance, assessing it not as a threat, but as a threshold. He followed her as she urged her horse forward, through the tight passage that opened into a sight that stole the air from his lungs. The valley was a secret emerald world cradled in the arms of the mountains. A meadow of tall, green grass sloped gently down to a stand of cottonwood trees whose leaves shimmered like silver coins in the breeze. And through it all, a ribbon of water so clear it seemed to be made of liquid light bubbled up from a spring surrounded by smooth white stones before winding its way through the meadow. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth, wild mint, and pine. After the sun-scorched hell they had traversed, it felt like the first day of creation. Clara slid from her horse, her legs unsteady. She didn't look at Ethan. She didn't look at anything but the spring. She walked toward it, her steps hesitant at first, then more certain, like a pilgrim reaching a holy site. She knelt on the soft moss that grew by the water's edge and plunged her hands into the cold, clear depths. The water was so pure she could count the pebbles on the bottom. She brought her cupped hands to her face and let the water run over her skin, over her eyes, over the pale, puckered line of the scar on her cheek. It wasn't a desperate cleansing, but a slow, deliberate greeting. She was reintroducing herself to the source of her name. A single tear traced a path through the water on her face, but it wasn't a tear of sorrow. It was a tear of arrival. Ethan remained by the horses, giving her the moment. He unsaddled the animals, letting them graze on the sweet grass, his movements slow and reverent. He watched her by the spring, a still figure against the vibrant life of the valley. He saw the tension that had held her rigid for weeks finally drain away, leaving a quiet strength in its place. The ghost of Tom Garrett, the shadow of Tuco, the memory of the brand, they had no place here. They were specters of a different world. When she finally rose, she turned to him. The setting sun caught in her wet hair, making a halo of it. Her eyes were clear. "My father used to say this. Water held the memories of the mountains," she said, her voice soft but steady. "That if you listened, you could hear them." Ethan walked toward her, stopping a few feet away. He was a wise man. He reached into the inner pocket of his worn coat and pulled out a small, cracked leather pouch, darkened with age and sweat. He held it out to her. "I believe this belongs to you." Clara looked at the pouch, then at him, her brow furrowed in confusion. Hesitantly, she took it. The leather was soft, familiar. She loosened the drawstring and tipped the contents into her palm. A single perfect eagle feather lay stark against her skin. She stared at it, her mind reeling. She remembered the blinding snow, the bitter wind, the half-dead man she'd found near frozen and adrift, his leg broken. She remembered dragging him to a small hunter's lean-to, setting the bone as best she could, forcing broth between his lips for days. He had been delirious with fever, a ghost already. She never knew if he'd lived. Before she left, with a blizzard threatening to seal the pass, she had scratched her name in the dirt and left the feather, a charm for safe passage her mother had given her, in a pouch by his side, a prayer to a man she'd never see again. She looked up at Ethan, her eyes wide with disbelief. "It was you," she breathed. "The man in the snow." He nodded once, the corner of his mouth ticking upwards in a faint, sad smile. "I woke up and you were gone. All I had was a name in the dirt and this." He gestured to the feather in her hand. "I didn't know if you were real. After a while, I started to think maybe I'd imagined you. A fever dream. When you said your name in that cantina, it was like being struck by lightning. The whole story clicked into place. The debt, the unhesitating risk, the quiet protection. It was never for a stranger. It was for her. You saved my life, Clara," he said, his voice low and raw with the truth he'd held for 3 years. "All I did was return the favor." She closed her hand around the feather, its edges pressing into her palm. The circle was complete. The quiet man who had appeared in her darkest hour was the same one whose life she had saved in his. Their paths were not a random collision. They were an orbit, bound by a shared history of survival they hadn't even known they possessed. "That story you told me," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "about the man who cooked 2 plates for his dead wife. I was that man," Ethan admitted, his gaze steady on hers. "For a long time. It's a hard habit to break, being alone." He took a step closer, closing the small distance between them. The air was charged, not with tension, but with a profound, unspoken understanding. "I was thinking," he said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "I could build a cabin, right here, by the trees." He paused. "And a table, big enough for two." It wasn't a question. It was an offering, a plan, a future. Clara looked around the valley, at the setting sun turning the granite peaks to gold, at the clear water bubbling from the earth, at the man standing before her who was both a debt paid and a promise made. The fear was gone. The running was over. The story she had invented to protect this place was a lie, but the story she was about to live was the truest thing in the world. "Yes," she said, the single word holding the weight of a lifetime. "I think you should." She smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes and erased the last shadow of the scar. "This is home." Spring returned to Agua Clara, not as a guest, but as a birthright. A year had passed since Ethan and Clara had walked into the valley, leaving the ghosts of the desert behind them. The seasons had turned, and with them, their world had been remade. Where there had been only wild meadow and a promise, there was now a life. The cabin stood near the stand of cottonwoods, solid and true against the backdrop of the granite peaks. Ethan had built it with his own hands, felling the pines himself, squaring the logs with an adze until they fit together as if they had grown that way. It was not a large home, but it was strong, with a deep stone hearth that smelled of wood smoke and security, and windows that looked out onto a world of green. A porch ran the length of the front, its wood already silvering in the sun, and on it sat two chairs, worn into perfect comfort. Before the cabin, the earth had been turned and tended. A garden flourished, its neat rows of corn, beans, and squash a testament to shared labor. A small corral housed two sturdy horses, and a handful of chickens scratched in the dirt, their clucking a gentle domestic sound that filled the quiet air. This was the sanctuary they had earned, not a fortress, but a homestead, built not for hiding, but for living. The false legend they had spun in Santa Fe had done its work. Twice in that year, Ethan had ridden out to the edge of the territories for salt, flour, and news. He'd listened in dusty trading posts, a quiet man nursing a coffee, and heard the whispers. The story of the cursed valley had grown fangs and claws in the telling. Some said a man who drank the water would see his skin turn to snakeskin. Others claimed the ghosts of a murdered family haunted the spring, dragging prospectors to a watery grave. The truth of Agua Clara was safe, buried under a mountain of lies. Their peace was guarded by the very greed and superstition they had once fled. One evening, as the sun began its slow descent, painting the valley in hues of soft gold and rose, Ethan came to Clara, where she sat on the porch, mending one of his shirts. He didn't speak, but stood before her until she looked up. In his hands he held two simple hand-carved wooden cups, polished smooth with beeswax. "The spring is running high tonight," he said, his voice as calm and deep as the valley itself. "I thought we should pay our respects." Clara set aside her sewing, a knowing softness in her eyes. She took one of the cups. Together they walked through the tall grass, their steps falling into a familiar rhythm. They didn't hold hands. Their connection was something that needed no physical tether. It existed in the shared air between them, in the silent understanding that had grown from a debt into a partnership, and from a partnership into a quiet, unshakable love. They stopped at the edge of the spring, where the water bubbled up from the earth, eternally new. The place felt sacred in the twilight, the stones around it like ancient altars. Ethan knelt and filled both cups with the cold, clear water. He handed one to her. He looked at her, at the woman who had saved him from the snow and whom he had pulled from the jaws of hell. The terror that had haunted her eyes in the El Paso cantina was a distant memory, replaced by a deep-seated calm that mirrored his own. The scar on her cheek was a faint, pale line now, no more remarkable than a crease of laughter by his own eyes. It was part of her history, part of the landscape of the woman he loved. "There are no laws in this valley but the ones we make," he began, his voice low and steady. "No words to be said but our own." He raised his cup a fraction. "I came here carrying a ghost. You gave me a home. My fire is your fire. My table is your table. As long as this water flows, I am yours." Clara felt the truth of his words settle deep in her bones. She thought of the long, silent walks, the shared meals over a desperate fire, the moment in the canyon when she had found her strength, the day in this very spot when she had found the man who was the other half of her own story. She reached up and from the simple braid of her hair, she pulled the single, perfect eagle feather. She held it in her palm, the feather he had carried for 3 years as a prayer and a mystery. "I came here carrying only a memory of what was lost," she answered, her voice clear in the evening air. She held the feather out to him. "You gave it back to me. You gave me back my home." She took his calloused hand and curled his fingers around the feather's quill. "My memory is your memory now. My home is your home. As long as these mountains stand, I am yours." They didn't need a witness. The mountains were their witness. The spring was their testament. They drank the water, a silent, solemn toast. It tasted of stone and earth and beginnings. When they were done, Ethan gently took her hand. He turned it over and poured the last drops of water from his cup into her palm, washing it clean. Then she did the same for him. It was a baptism and a promise, a washing away of the blood and dust of the trail, leaving only what was pure and what was theirs. He let go of her hand and softly touched her cheek, his thumb tracing the faint line of the scar. It was not a gesture of pity or a desire to erase it, but one of reverence, an acknowledgement of the steel in her, of the fight she had won. "Clara Call," he said, testing the name on his tongue for the first time. "It suits you." A true smile lit her face, reaching her eyes. "It suits us," she corrected gently. They stood there for a long time, as the first stars pricked the deep purple canopy of the sky. They didn't need to speak of the future. They were standing in it. The legacy of her parents was not a secret map to a water source. It was this: a life, thriving and at peace. Their own legacy was not a story of gunslinging or vengeance, but a quiet testament to the idea that the deepest wounds could be healed, that a cage could be remade into a sanctuary, and that two solitary people could, against all odds, build a world together. Later they sat on the porch of the home he had built for them, in the chairs that fit them perfectly. The soft yellow light from the cabin's windows spilled out, a beacon of warmth in the vast, wild dark. The valley was silent but for the chirping of crickets and the distant murmur of the spring. Ethan's arm rested on the back of her chair, not quite touching her, but a solid, constant presence. They had found their agua clara, not just in the land, but in each other. Out in the world beyond the peaks, men might still chase rumors and fear curses, but here, in the heart of the valley, there was only the profound, unshakable truth of home. The journey was over. The running had stopped. And in the quiet peace of the mountain night, their life was just beginning. The story of Ethan Call and Clara reminds us that the greatest sanctuary isn't always a hidden valley, but the courage to reclaim what was taken from you. They didn't find peace by running from their past, but by outsmarting it, proving that on the frontier, a clever mind could be more powerful than a fast gun. Theirs is a legacy built not on a map of land, but on a foundation of trust, resilience, and a love that was as clear and as deep as the water they fought to protect. It's these kinds of tales where grit and heart carve out a life in a hard land that we aim to keep alive here at Wild Old West Memories. If you were moved by their journey, be sure to subscribe to our channel and ring that bell, so you never miss another story from the unforgiving heart of the American West. Let us know in the comments what you think the future holds for Ethan and Clara in their valley. Until our trails cross again, keep your wits sharp and your heart true. Remember that the past is a trail you can't erase, but you can always choose where it leads.